the deep shadows of an isolated southern plantation, where power decided fate and silence hid every sin, there lived a woman whose story was whispered only in the dead of night. They said she shared a bed with every man on that land, long before she ever walked down the aisle with the owner himself. But behind those rumors was a truth far more twisted, because nothing she did was ever driven by desire. It was survival, strategy, manipulation sharpened into a weapon in a world where she owned nothing, not even her own name. To the men, she was temptation. To the women, she was betrayal. But to herself, she was a mind fighting to stay alive in a place built to break her. Every step she took, every choice she made, was part of a larger plan, one that would turn the entire plantation upside down and expose the darkest corners of its rotten heart. This is the story of how a powerless slave learned to control the very people who claimed to own her, and how she used the chains meant to trap her as the very tools that led her to power. She was born into a world that had already decided her worth, her body, and her place. The plantation into which she came was a sprawling empire of labor and control, a place where men and women alike were reduced to nothing more than tools, commodities, and numbers in a ledger. From the moment she opened her eyes, she could feel the weight of oppression pressing down, an invisible hand shaping the way she moved, spoke, and even thought. Childhood, as it is often remembered in fairer worlds, was a concept entirely foreign to her. Play and laughter existed only in fleeting moments stolen between long days of work and constant surveillance, and the lessons she learned were lessons of caution, observation, and endurance. She watched the adults around her, about the slaves who bent under the whip, and the masters who wielded it and absorbed every nuance of fear, anger, and power. Every glance, every subtle gesture told a story, and she was an eager student, learning quickly that survival depended on reading people as sharply as they read her. From the very beginning, the boundaries were clear. Certain areas of the plantation were forbidden, certain conversations were dangerous, and every action carried consequences far beyond what a child should bear. She noticed how the other slaves whispered in corners, how they measured words carefully, how laughter could vanish in a heartbeat when the overseer appeared. She noticed the men, the fleeting moments of vulnerability they displayed when they thought no one was watching. And she noticed the women, whose eyes held both sorrow and quiet fury, a simmering resistance that often found its outlet in secrecy and subtle defiance. She learned that the smallest gestures, a tilt of the head, a smile, averted eyes, can signal allegiance, submission, or rebellion, and she stored these lessons like treasure, knowing one day they might serve her in ways no one could imagine. Her adolescence brought a deeper understanding of her own body and the power it could wield, a dangerous truth she discovered in the quiet, hushed corners of the fields and cabins. She became aware that the men watched her with desire, that they measured her in ways she had not consented to, but could not ignore. At first, this awareness was terrifying, a reminder that she was a vessel of others' lust, trapped in a system that allowed no escape. But as time passed, fear transformed into observation, and observation into strategy. She realized that while she could not control the brutality around her, she could control how she presented herself, how she allowed herself to be seen, and how she might influence those who held power over her life and the lives of those around her. Every glance she returned, every word she chose to speak, every sigh or shiver became a tool in her growing arsenal of survival tactics. The adult slaves around her became unwitting instructors. She watched older women who had survived decades of exploitation and learned from their methods of endurance. Some were quiet, maintaining a semblance of invisibility, avoiding attention to escape punishment. Others wielded their sexuality and cunning to gain small freedoms, temporary reprieves, or privileges in an unforgiving system. She absorbed both styles, noting which moments invited danger and which offered opportunity. She learned to navigate a treacherous world in which trust was a luxury, and betrayal could appear from the most unexpected quarters. Her mind became sharp, calculating, always one step ahead of the threats that could spring from either fellow slaves or the overseers, who patrolled the fields with whip in hand and judgment in their eyes. Work itself became a teacher. The relentless labor in the fields, the long hours under the scorching sun, the cold, exhausting nights, all of it honed her endurance and shaped her resilience. Her body became a weapon, not just a target, conditioned to withstand hardship while masking every sign of weakness. She learned how to appear compliant, to seem subservient and obedient when it suited her, while quietly observing the rhythms, patterns, and vulnerabilities of those around her. Every man on the plantation revealed some weakness, some pride, some desire that could be cataloged, understood, and remembered. She discovered that the very power meant to subjugate her could be mirrored back, manipulated, and used in her favor if wielded carefully. Her relationship with fear became intimate. Fear was no longer simply something to endure. It became a guide, a signal that highlighted danger, opportunity, or the precise moment to act. She learned to disguise fear as courage, to let it sharpen her instincts rather than paralyze her, to move through spaces where others trembled. The adults often spoke of punishment, of the horrors meted out to those who disobeyed. Yet she studied those punishments as lessons in human behavior, memorizing the limits, the triggers, and the inconsistencies of those who enforced them. She discovered that cruelty, though seemingly absolute, was riddled with patterns, and if those patterns could be anticipated, survival became a game of prediction, timing, and careful maneuvering. At the same time, she nurtured the small spark of her own ambition. Deep inside, beneath layers of fear and observation, she felt a desire not just to survive, but to transform the rules of the world around her. She realized early that brute force would never serve her. The only power she could claim in a place like this was subtle, indirect, and psychological. She honed her ability to read intentions, manipulate perception, and create alliances where none naturally existed. She learned to speak softly, but be remembered, to be seen, but misunderstood, to navigate the complicated hierarchies of both slaves and masters alike. Every interaction became an experiment in influence. Every glance and negotiation in a landscape dominated by violence and desire. Her adolescence was also marked by isolation, a solitude that was both imposed and chosen. There were few who could be trusted, fewer still who could truly understand the world she inhabited. The isolation forced her to reflect, to plan, to rehearse possibilities in her mind. She began to understand her body and presence as a form of currency, one that could be exchanged not only for protection, but also for leverage. She realized that the system sought to use her. Yet if she could learn to anticipate and respond, she could turn the system's own mechanisms to her advantage. Every day, every season, every encounter sharpened her understanding of human nature, power, and desire. She became a silent observer of cruelty and a master of subtle influence. Her early life on the plantation, filled with brutality, exploitation, and fear, had forged in her a mind both alert and strategic. By the time she approached adulthood, she had cultivated a unique combination of caution, insight, and subtle cunning, a toolkit born not of privilege, but of necessity. She understood that in this world, survival depended not on innocence or strength alone, but on the ability to see the currents of power and bend them, however quietly, to her own ends. Once she recognized the power of perception, she began to shape it meticulously, learning that influence over men could be as vital to survival as any physical skill. The plantation was a kingdom of hierarchies, where every man believed himself a master of some domain, yet each was vulnerable to the subtle currents of desire, fear, and ego. She understood early that the men who worked, oversaw, or owned portions of the land were not invincible. They were human, flawed, and capable of manipulation if approached with precision. The first lesson was observation. She would watch the way each man moved, the way his eyes lingered, the way he spoke when he believed no one was paying attention. Small behaviors revealed immense truths, insecurities hidden behind arrogance, ambitions cloaked in casual conversation, lust masked as authority. She cataloged these patterns silently, remembering details that would later become keys in unlocking control over those who thought themselves untouchable. Seduction, she realized, was not simply about desire. It was a language, an art of influence that required timing, subtlety, and understanding. She began testing this language carefully, choosing moments where vulnerability intersected with opportunity. A soft laugh here, a well-timed smile there, a whispered word in the shadow of labor all became tools of manipulation. She learned to offer attention and withdrawal in equal measure, creating longing, curiosity, and the illusion of choice. To every man, she presented herself differently, tailoring her approach to his temperament and ambition. Some were softened by the hint of admiration, some provoked by defiance, and some ensnared by quiet empathy. She recognized early that control was not about coercion alone. It was about shaping perception, directing attention, and exploiting desire in ways so subtle that the men themselves rarely realized they were being guided. Her reputation began to spread quietly across the plantation. She was whispered about in the quarters and in the overseer's house alike. To some men, she was a mystery that demanded attention, an enigma they sought to unravel. To others, she was a temptation they could not resist, though the reasoning behind their fascination was often unclear even to themselves. She carefully curated this duality, the balance between intrigue and accessibility, allure and restraint. Every interaction was calculated to maintain the tension of desire while preserving her autonomy. She learned to measure the exact moment when a gaze, a word, or a gesture would yield compliance without revealing the full scope of her intent. Every slip or error could be dangerous. Yet she moved with the precision of someone who had rehearsed each step in her mind countless times. Manipulation extended beyond the personal. She became adept at exploiting the hierarchies of the plantation itself, understanding that power could be leveraged not just through intimacy, but through information, rumor, and subtle alliances. She listened to whispered secrets, noted rivalries, and observed jealousies. She learned which men sought validation, which hungered for control, and which could be coaxed into doing her bidding through flattery or insinuation. She discovered that influence often flowed more effectively through suggestion than direct command, that planning ideas could steer behavior in ways that overt action never could. She cultivated relationships with those who could protect her, those who could vouch for her, and even those who might unknowingly become pawns in her growing network of subtle control. Her mastery of psychological manipulation grew alongside a deepening understanding of human nature. She realized that fear could be as powerful as desire if wielded carefully, and that men who appeared dominant were often most susceptible to challenges to their ego. A well-timed display of confidence, a calculated withdrawal of attention, or a quiet challenge could bend even the strongest wills. She learned to read micro-expressions, to sense shifts in mood, and to anticipate reactions before they occurred. Each encounter became an experiment in influence, a lesson in power dynamics, and an opportunity to refine her strategies. Over time, she became almost invisible in her calculations, a silent force directing outcomes from behind the scenes, while maintaining the outward appearance of compliance. In the quarters and the cabins, she practiced the subtle art of persuasion among fellow slaves, understanding that influence there could extend her reach even further. By cultivating trust, sympathy, and perceived loyalty, she created networks of information and support that would prove invaluable. She learned that the men's perceptions of these networks were often as important as the networks themselves, as rumors and reputations could be manipulated to sow confusion, bolster her position, or isolate threats. Every whisper, every glance, every carefully placed observation became a part of a larger strategy, a map of influence that extended far beyond what most could perceive. The men on the plantation became both instruments and obstacles. She approached each with a strategy tailored to their temperament, desires, and weaknesses. Some required gentle coaxing, others needed the illusion of challenge, and some could be guided with a simple word at the right moment. She discovered that control did not need to be overt. Often, the illusion of power was more effective than power itself. She could make men act in ways that benefited her, protect her, or provide her leverage, all while leaving them believing the choice had been theirs. It was a delicate dance, one that demanded constant attention, observation, and adjustment, but she became adept at it, weaving a web of influence that extended invisibly across the plantation. Her body, presence, and mind became inseparable instruments of manipulation. She moved with a rhythm that invited observation, yet she knew when to retreat into invisibility. She spoke in ways that encouraged disclosure, but she never revealed her full intentions. She smiled when it served her purpose, frowned when subtle intimidation was necessary, and remained silent when ambiguity offered greater leverage. She learned to embody contradictions, availability and restraint, warmth and calculation, vulnerability and control all at once, and in doing so, she created a persona that was impossible to pin down or predict. As time passed, the scope of her influence grew. Men who had once dismissed her or overlooked her presence began to seek her attention, eager for the approval, understanding, or intimacy she could selectively provide. She understood that manipulation was not just about bending others to her will, but about creating dependencies, shaping desires, and orchestrating perceptions in ways that extended her reach without drawing overt suspicion. The plantation itself became a stage for her strategy, each individual a player responding to cues she had carefully orchestrated. Every interaction became part of a larger performance, every glance, word, or gesture a note in the symphony of influence she was conducting. Through patience, observation, and relentless calculation. She transformed herself from a powerless adolescent into a woman whose mind could navigate the most dangerous currents of desire and authority. She learned that manipulation was not simply a tool for survival, it was a language of power, one that allowed her to operate in a world where brute strength and social position had been denied to her. Her understanding of human nature, combined with her ability to exploit desire and ego, gave her a kind of authority that transcended the limitations imposed by the plantation. It was subtle, invisible, and incredibly effective, and it became the foundation for the next stage of her journey, where influence would evolve into something even more decisive, shaping not just her survival, but her ultimate control over the world around her. The turning point in her carefully orchestrated life came when the plantation owner himself became the focus of her strategy. Unlike the overseers or the other men whose attention she had mastered manipulating, he was a figure of ultimate authority, a man whose power over the land, the labor, and the lives of everyone on it was absolute. To approach him was to step into a world of far greater danger, a place where a single miscalculation could destroy not only her ambitions, but her life. Yet she understood that influence over him would be the key to achieving a position that went beyond survival, a space where her mind and strategy could operate without constant fear. She had learned the patterns of the men who served under him, the ways in which desire, ego, and ambition shaped decisions, and she knew that if she could navigate these dynamics, she could bring him into her orbit. Her initial encounters with the owner were marked by extreme caution. She observed him from a distance, studying his routines, his moods, and his interactions with both slaves and overseers. Every gesture, every expression, every word carried meaning, and she cataloged them meticulously, as she had done with the others, only now the stakes were infinitely higher. He was a man accustomed to command, to deference, to unquestioned obedience, as she realized that any hint of overt ambition or manipulation would be met with suspicion, punishment, or worse. Instead, she approached with subtlety, allowing herself to be noticed without appearing to seek attention, to be observed without revealing the depth of her intentions. She understood the psychology of power better than many men she had encountered. She knew that a man in authority craved acknowledgement, respect, and validation even as he demanded submission. She tailored her interactions to exploit these needs carefully. A gesture of recognition here, a word of deference there, and a hint of intelligence that suggested she could think for herself without challenging his dominance, all were carefully calibrated. She created an image of a woman both compliant and intriguing, someone whose presence demanded notice but posed no immediate threat. Every movement was a negotiation, every glance a test of boundaries, every word a strategic placement on the chessboard she had imagined in her mind. As her influence over him grew, she began to use the network she had cultivated among the other men and slaves to reinforce her position. Rumors, perceptions, and carefully managed interactions were tools that allowed her to appear more desirable, more trustworthy, and more indispensable in his eyes. She understood that control over perception was as important as control over action. By ensuring that others spoke well of her, or at least created an aura of respect and intrigue, she reinforced the narrative she wished the owner to perceive. It was a complex dance, requiring patience, timing, and constant recalibration. But she had honed these skills through years of careful observation and practice. Her understanding of desire and ego became increasingly important. She knew that to gain his attention, she could not simply rely on charm or beauty alone. She needed to engage his sense of dominance and admiration. She offered glimpses of her intellect, subtle displays of wit, and moments of vulnerability that suggested she could be both cared for and respected. She learned to read his responses carefully, adjusting her approach according to his mood, his pride, and his expectations. Every interaction was measured, every gesture considered, and every word chosen to advance her strategy while maintaining plausible deniability. At the same time, she continued to manage the men under his authority, ensuring that they remained under her influence. By maintaining subtle control over these intermediaries, she created a buffer that protected her from direct scrutiny while amplifying her perceived value. The plantation itself became a stage upon which she conducted a continuous performance, each act reinforcing her position, each relationship carefully manipulated to serve her long-term goals. She was always aware that a single misstep could unravel everything, and so her strategy was layered, complex, and constantly evolving. Her intelligence, patience, An ability to navigate psychological landscapes became evident not only to herself, but increasingly to the owner. He began to notice her in ways that went beyond mere attraction. Her insight, her composure, and her subtle influence set her apart from others on the plantation. She was no longer just a figure of desire. She became a mind capable of understanding and managing the currents of power around her. This awareness allowed her to shift from survival to initiative, from reaction to orchestration. She could anticipate his desires, manage expectations, and guide decisions without ever appearing to assert control overtly. Every interaction with him was a test, a negotiation, and an opportunity. She learned the art of timing, recognizing when to approach and when to withdraw, when to speak and when to remain silent. She understood that power could be wielded not only through direct influence, but through suggestion, implication, and absence. By creating spaces of longing, curiosity, and dependency, she gradually became indispensable, not merely as a presence of beauty or charm, but as someone whose understanding of people and situations subtly shaped outcomes. Her mastery over the smaller dynamics of the plantation amplified her effect on the owner. By the time she approached the pivotal moments in their relationship, she had already mapped the desires, insecurities, and tendencies of every relevant person around him. She had created conditions that made her alliance attractive, even advantageous, to him. The stage was set in such a way that he began to see her not merely as a woman on the plantation, but as someone whose presence could be both desired and useful. She had transformed her survival skills, her understanding of manipulation, and her careful cultivation of influence into a force that even the ultimate authority could not ignore. Her eventual marriage to the owner, when it came, was not the result of sudden affection, but of a carefully executed strategy that took years to perfect. Every calculated smile, every carefully placed gesture, every moment of observation, and every subtle interaction had prepared her for this transformation. She did not simply walk into power. She had built a path to it, one step at a time, using intelligence, observation, and manipulation as her guides. The marriage, then, was the culmination of a long journey in which she turned the very forces designed to oppress her into instruments of personal elevation. Yet even as she secured this unprecedented position, she remained aware of the delicate balance required to maintain it. The owner's authority was absolute, but she had learned that influence could be preserved through perception, subtle guidance, and the careful orchestration of desire and ego. She continued to navigate the currents of the plantation, managing relationships, guiding perception, and maintaining the aura of compliance while extending her reach. The marriage had granted her a new level of safety and opportunity, but it also required continued vigilance, strategic thinking, and an unrelenting awareness of the power dynamics that surrounded her. By winning the trust and eventual marriage of the plantation owner, she demonstrated that power could be claimed through intellect, patience, and manipulation, even in a world designed to deny it. She had moved beyond survival and influence over intermediaries. She now occupied a position from which she could shape the lives, actions, and decisions of those around her in ways previously unimaginable. The turning point was not a single act, but a series of calculated moves, all guided by observation, patience, and the careful management of desire and perception. Her ability to understand and exploit the psychology of the most powerful man on the plantation marked a transformation from a woman constrained by fear to one who could navigate authority, desire, and influence with precision. The aftermath of her calculated rise to power on the plantation was a complex and multifaceted reality, one that extended far beyond the marriage itself. Her actions had shifted the balance of influence in ways that few could fully comprehend. Among the other slaves, her reputation grew into a mixture of awe, resentment, and fear. Some admired her intelligence, her courage, and her ability to manipulate a world designed to crush her. Others whispered in envy, questioning the morality of the choices she had made, the lines she had crossed, and the means she had used to achieve what they themselves could only dream of. In this environment, perception mattered as much as reality, and she carefully managed both, understanding that her legacy was as much about the story told by others as the action she herself had taken. The men who had once sought her attention now became instruments of observation and caution. They watched her with a mixture of lingering desire and grudging respect, recognizing that she had outmaneuvered them all in ways subtle enough to avoid direct confrontation, yet undeniable in their outcomes. She had demonstrated a mastery of power dynamics that few could resist. a capacity to influence desire, manipulate perception, and guide decisions without the need for force. In the process, she had revealed truths about human nature, that power is rarely absolute, that ego can be guided like a leash, and that those who appear dominant are often most susceptible to subtle manipulation. Her story, though hidden behind the veil of the plantation's daily routines, became a lesson in strategy, intelligence, and the quiet assertion of control. Her marriage to the owner did not mark the end of her vigilance. While she had secured a position of unparalleled influence, she was acutely aware that power in such a world was fragile. Authority could shift with a single act, a single word, a single perception. She continued to navigate the complex network of relationships within the plantation, ensuring that loyalty, fear, and respect remained balanced in a way that protected her position. Every interaction, whether with slaves, overseers, or the owner himself, became a test of her ability to maintain influence, manage perception, and prevent threats from emerging. She had learned that the tools that had brought her to this point, subtlety, observation, and manipulation, were now essential for maintaining her carefully constructed empire. The impact of her actions extended beyond personal survival and influence. They began to alter the social fabric of the plantation. The men, once confident in their unquestioned dominance, had to reconsider their assumptions about control, authority, and desire. The women, some emboldened, some resentful, had to navigate a shifting landscape where allegiances, reputations, and social hierarchies were in flux. Every individual on the plantation became part of a complex web of power and influence, one that she had crafted with meticulous care. Her ability to guide perception and manipulate outcomes had created a dynamic in which even the most entrenched power structures were no longer absolute, highlighting the fragility of authority when faced with intellect and strategy. She also began to influence the plantation owner in ways that extended beyond personal affection or desire. Her insights, her awareness of the people around him, and her subtle guidance allowed her to shape decisions, manage crises, and influence the daily operations of the plantation. He began to rely on her judgment, sometimes without even recognizing the depth of her involvement, creating a dependence that further solidified her position. Through her influence, she demonstrated that intelligence, perception, and strategic manipulation could rival brute strength, formal authority, or social privilege, creating a paradigm in which power was as much about understanding people as it was about commanding them. Among the other slaves, her actions created a dual legacy. Some saw her as a survivor, a woman who had turned oppression into a form of influence and autonomy, someone who had navigated a system designed to crush her and emerge with control. Others viewed her with suspicion or resentment, interpreting her choices as betrayal, complicity, or exploitation. This duality reflected the complex moral landscape of survival under slavery, where actions necessary for life can simultaneously provoke admiration and condemnation. She understood these perspectives and used them to further her position, managing both loyalty and fear in ways that reinforced her authority while minimizing threats. Her ability to maintain influence also depended on the careful management of secrecy. Many of the manipulations, observations, and psychological strategies that had propelled her into power remained hidden, unknown even to those closest to her. The subtlety of her methods was crucial. Overt displays of control could provoke retaliation or suspicion, whereas invisible influence allowed her to shape outcomes without exposing herself to danger. She had learned that true power often lay in the unseen, in the quiet orchestration of events, in the ability to guide decisions while remaining a figure of apparent compliance. This understanding allowed her to maintain her position, protect herself, and continue her strategic navigation of the complex social environment around her. Her story also highlights the ways in which power can transform relationships. The owner, once an untouchable figure of authority, became a participant in a subtle dynamic in which influence and desire intersected. The men she had manipulated previously had to reconcile with the reality that her intellect, strategy, and presence now outweighed their own efforts. The women on the plantation had to navigate a world reshaped by her actions, where influence and survival were intertwined with perception, strategy, and subtle social maneuvering. Her rise demonstrated that power was not solely determined by social position, physical dominance, or institutional authority, but could be attained through intelligence, observation, and psychological acuity. The legacy of her manipulation and strategic rise became evident in the ongoing functioning of the plantation. Decisions, alliances, and interactions were subtly shaped by her influence, even as she maintained the appearance of compliance or subservience. Her methods: careful observation, subtle manipulation, strategic use of desire and ego created a dynamic in which she could exert control. Without overt confrontation, she had transformed a world designed to limit her into one in which she could operate with a degree of autonomy, influence, and power previously unavailable to someone of her status. The intricate web she had woven allowed her to shape outcomes, guide perceptions, and maintain authority while minimizing exposure to the dangers inherent in such an environment. Her story, in its aftermath, serves as a profound lesson in human behavior, power, and survival. It demonstrates that influence can be cultivated, that perception can be managed, and that authority is never as absolute as it appears. Through patience, strategy, and careful observation, she had turned the tools of oppression into instruments of power. The social, emotional, and psychological dynamics of the plantation were forever altered by her presence, highlighting the interplay between desire, fear, intelligence, and strategy. Her choices revealed the fragility of domination when confronted with subtle manipulation and the capacity of an individual to navigate even the most oppressive circumstances with calculated skill. In managing her newfound position, she also had to remain vigilant against the ever-present threat of envy, retaliation, or misjudgment. The power she wielded, though carefully constructed, existed within a fragile ecosystem of perception and influence. Each decision, each interaction, each moment of observation continued to shape her ongoing survival and authority. She had transformed herself into a figure whose impact reached far beyond her own immediate needs, demonstrating that manipulation, intelligence, and strategic calculation could reshape the social order, even in a world designed to deny her agency. In the end, she stood not as a victim of the plantation, but as its quiet orchestrator, a force that no whip, no threat, and no hierarchy could fully contain. Every glance, every whispered word, every calculated gesture had built a web of influence so subtle, so complete, that even the men who believed themselves in control were, unknowingly, playing the game she had designed. The owner, once untouchable and absolute, had become a participant in her strategy, guided by the very perception she had cultivated. The other men, who had sought to dominate her, now bowed if only unconsciously to her understanding of desire, ego, and fear. The women, who had watched her with suspicion and awe, were forced to acknowledge that survival could take forms far more cunning than brute endurance. Her life became proof that power was never solely in the hands of those who claimed it. It resided in minds that could see, calculate, and act with precision, in hearts that could endure yet manipulate, and in wills that refused to remain silent under oppression. The plantation, a place designed to break bodies and spirits, had instead forged one of the most dangerous minds it had ever contained. She had turned the chains meant to bind her into instruments of control, the gaze meant to dominate her into leverage, and the desire of men into tools that elevated her above the very world that sought to crush her. Every man, every woman, every life on that plantation had been touched by her influence, whether they knew it or not. And while the whispers of her deeds of cunning, seduction, and survival might have been dismissed as rumor by some, the reality was undeniable. She had rewritten the rules of power in that place. Her legacy was not merely in her survival, but in the proof that intelligence, patience, and strategic manipulation could carve dominion even in the harshest, most oppressive of worlds. And so she remained untouchable in ways the masters could not measure, feared in ways the enslaved could scarcely understand, and alive with a power that no chain, no law, no social order could contain. She had become the living testament to one undeniable truth. In a world ruled by cruelty, the mind that refuses to be broken becomes the most terrifying weapon of all.